Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning and taking time out of your day. I think everyone is, well, there's lots of people who are maybe going to be joining in a little while as well, but I thought we could get going as well. Just before I start, please do feel free to ask questions. Please feel free to get involved in the discussion as well. If you raise your hand or just put something in the chat, I can come to you. Yeah, so I'm just going to get started now. So I'm Krishna Gandham. I'm Managing Director of the Consulting Division at Keystream. As an organisation, we help the public sector to transform using digital solutions. But today, what I want to talk about is more than just digital. It's change programmes in general across the public sector, especially into the NHS as well. And what we find most of the time is, although we start the change programme, we start with all the rigour in the world and everyone's very excited at the beginning. Near the end, people start to fall away. And what we don't quite get to is the realisation of benefits. And that's because everyone's waiting for the go live. Everyone talks about go live, and not even just in digital solutions, anything that you're changing, you always have that date in mind that on that day it will switch and the whole world's going to get better. But what we then forget is actually optimisation after go live is so important, because otherwise we can't actually realise those stuff. So I'm joined today by Steve Lobley and Daniel King. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. Steve is from the operational project management side as well, and Dan is from the clinical side. So I'm hoping we've got all opinions in the room. So what I think is really important all the time is to make sure we've always got the clinical, the operational and the digital opinion in the room, so we can be as efficient as possible as well. So I will hand over first to Steve to introduce himself.
Thank you, Krishna, and good morning, everybody. Really looking forward to having some lively dialogue with everybody this morning. As Krishna said, my name is Steve Lobley. So I've been in IT now for just coming up to 40 years, the last 20 years at the crossroads of healthcare and IT, the last 14 years contracting. So I kind of do bring a breadth and depth across the whole piece. I've got some fairly strong opinions. I do suffer from career limiting frankness, and they'll probably come out. And of course, even just putting together where I've worked, since I started, it was computing, then IT, then ICT, then IM&T, and then IDT, and now DDAT. So, it's kind of pretty much the same stuff, and we'll get into some of that, because as Krishna quite rightly says, it's not just about the go live, it's about the stuff we eat and breathe every day. And I'm going to hand over to Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So good morning, everyone. Really nice to meet you all, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk and share my own experiences today. As Krishna said, my name's Daniel King. I'm an NHS doctor. I'm an anaesthetic trainee currently at St George's. And I got involved in health technology almost by accident. So I spent about 18 months working in management consulting in the middle of my training. From day one, I was almost exclusively involved in health IT. So initially working on development, I worked on pathway management systems, AI theatre scheduling, and then worked on implementation. And then I took a big step into the world of clinical safety, which is really where I continue to work and where my interests mainly lie. I took the slightly unusual step of returning full-time into the NHS. I'm once again a user of IT in healthcare, but I do continue to do some work around safe implementation of technology, and I work as a CSO. Alongside my clinical work, I'm also an advisor to the Royal College of Anaesthetists on their digital and data strategy, sit in several national health technology groups. But yeah, looking forward to having the discussion today.
Okay, so I'm going to start with yourself, Dan, actually. I know that you just put yourself on mute, but I'm going to start with yourself. And just wanted to understand around the key steps that ensure clinical teams feel ownership of the digital system, because I feel like obviously they are the frontline workers as well, and that making sure that it should be helping their everyday life rather than hindering. So what would you say? How do we get impact on long-term adoption?
Gosh, yeah, it's a difficult question, but probably one that's quite fundamental to whether or not a new system survives and gets past the implementation phase. I think, firstly, as a clinician, I think it's important to acknowledge that anyone who spent any time working in the NHS will have had some sort of negative experience of IT. So either through the general infrastructure or through having new products implemented. I know my own experience of implementing software. There's often the feeling of outsiders who don't understand systems coming in and trying to disrupt ways of working. Like we don't understand like the last people who tried to implement change. And it's often seen as coming from without rather than within. And I think it's also important to recognise, specifically when we talk about clinical teams, that clinicians are busy and on the whole interested in helping patients. That's why they go to work. I think involving clinicians early in the design and testing phase is critical. Engaging clinicians through co-design, through user testing, ensuring that their input shapes the system to help create a shared sense of ownership. I think it improves user buy-in and helps create systems that are actually more relevant to clinical needs, resulting in better long-term adoption, smoother transition, and actually a system that works and does something that it's supposed to do rather than a system that exists for the sake of having the system. I think just on reflection, in my experience of implementing technology, people listen to me a lot more than other people. I think as a clinician, I think if you have the buy-in of senior clinicians, it really irons out a lot of the problems with early adoption. So having an internal champion from the clinical team that's banging the drum is really important. And I think it's also important to remember that clinicians, even clinicians in senior management roles, often need support. They're often not trained managers. They're fantastic clinicians, but they've, through whatever reason, they've ended up in those management roles. They may not have the training and background and experience that you have. And often they're doing their best whilst balancing their own clinical workload as well, and they need some extra support.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. That's really helpful. Yeah, it completely resonates as well. Actually, when things have gone well, when I've been working with clinicians, it is when they have a real passion for it and actually therefore have the time as well, because it is a time factor, isn't it? The fact that actually that is absolutely taking time away from their day where they should be with patients. So thank you for that. So Steve, then, so how can organisations balance the input of diverse stakeholders, such as operational teams, making sure the clinical leads are aware, but also understand the benefits and why we're doing this as well? And how do you get that, sorted within the planning to set up a system that meets everyone's needs?
Brilliant. Yeah, great question. And I totally resonate with everything Dan just said there, and I'm going to make some of that now. The bottom line is, it's all about the communications and early buy-in without question. One of the issues across healthcare is the sheer diversity of subject matter experts within their own realms, all then subdivided into their own speciality groups. Making sure that we give a voice at the highest level and then bringing it down. So not just from the CCIO, but then driving into the clinical groups is absolutely key. I've done some rollouts fairly recently, and I think I did just shy of nearly 90 face-to-face presentations over a 11-week period, just going out there and talking to people, making sure we get that buy-in and echoing that voice through the whole piece. So the way I like to describe it, this may sound like it's so simple, but it's so true. I say I sit at a table, a healthcare table. Safety, security, outcome, and experience are the 4 legs that support that. But I sit on a 3-legged stool, which is basically operational, clinical, and technology. I like my food to be balanced, and I like to sit on a very stable stool. So I always remind myself of those 7 things. So basic, but if I remind myself every time, then we've got a fighting chance of being on the table. So you build it into your overall planning that we're talking to all of those groups. Make sure that you have a key speaker for those groups. It doesn't necessarily mean the most senior people. We're looking for the Dans of this world. I've got to be quite honest with you. We're looking for people who are passionate, who really understand the wording, because the nomenclature is everything. Yeah, I come from an IT background, my digital background. I won't use the right words. Yeah, everybody's busy. Nobody's got any spare time. And if ever we did one thing, we will always go out and say, we want to do it with you, not to you. And we all know what happens. Things get railroaded through. Yeah, especially nowadays where we're investing in some of the really bigger solutions. I was at IBM for 14 years. I know what it's like when we come up with the truck. Yeah, the truck's parked outside, guys. You've got it. That's a big pill to swallow. So early engagement, massive communication, top down and bottom up. And what do I mean by that? So I've rolled out projects, we're portering. I've done portering now 3 or 4 times. You've got to make best friends with the porters. You've got to go on shifts with the porters. You've got to speak their language and understand what affects them. I've worked with cleaners, make sure we understand what they all do. It's very easy for us all to sit back and go, I understand how a hospital runs, but it's actually so easy to get out of sync as to how your specific environment runs. Early engagement, give them a voice and get them on the journey. That, to me, is the way that you'll get everybody bought into that whole piece.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And yeah, absolutely makes sense as well, doesn't it? That actually from an office, you can't tell how that's actually going to be used on the ground. So when you bring people into a workshop and you take them out of their their normal working life and ask them, how do you do this? Well, even if you were to do that at home, you couldn't tell people actually what actually happens. You need to shadow. So shadowing we do a lot of because of the
Yep.
fact that actually you see, and also everyone's got a different skill set. So I've always found if you look at it from a different angle, you will see something that maybe someone else hasn't quite picked up on. So yeah, absolutely.
100%.
Thank you. So Dan, what the practical approaches have you seen then, making new systems intuitive, unobtrusive in the clinical environment, especially as you say, as in your role as advisor to the Royal College of Anaesthetists as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's all. I think it's all about workflow, and simplifying workflows is probably key to implementing a successful product or application. You've got to make things easier. Like, people are already working very, very hard, and if you give them additional steps and make their job harder, even in the short term, that becomes quite obtrusive and quite disruptive. Systems have to be built with clear, easy to follow interfaces that adopt seamlessly into clinical routines. So it inevitably means technology has to be developed that solves an actual problem. It has to be developed alongside the teams that it's designed to support. As I mentioned before, early involvement of clinical teams, it works much better than trying to force a square system into a circular hole, for want of a better. And then in the post-go live phase, providing clinicians with training, like on the ground support during the initial phase, really helps with reducing friction. Anyone who's worked in the NHS for a period of time has been there when a new system has been implemented and it's been challenging and you haven't had the on the ground support to get it going. A focus on minimizing the number of steps to complete tasks. Anything that integrates into existing technologies that helps the system feel intuitive. But as we know, that's very challenging. I've worked overnight on intensive care units when you get a new system and it doesn't work as expected. I've had electronic prescribing systems fail. Nobody knows what to do. We go back to paper. So I think having that early support in place to support clinicians and support staff whose primary job is patient care and not technology is really, really important, especially in the early days. I think just wanted to reflect very quickly on just something that Steve had said as well, just about communication. We can't really say enough how important internal communication is. From both an implementation point of view, I've been there implementing technology and kind of shouting into the void as an external provider, but also it's much more impactful on the shop floor when your communications are coming from within. So I think that point Steve made is very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Just picking up on that, on the last point, actually, yes, we need to have someone dedicated within the organisation to shout the good shout, and fight the good fight, and making sure that everyone's around there. But also just picking up on something you said around training. And what I've always found works really well is asking the individual kind of groups to design their own training, giving them options. What works for you? What works for you right now? What works for the individual person? Let's get down right to the detail by this time of actually this group of people only come in from 9 till 4 on this specific day. Okay, well, we need to work out that that's what the training actually sits. So where I've seen it go wrong is when we have very rigid, well, we've only got trainers for this time, and so you have to come to this room at this time and wear a blue coat, otherwise you can't be trained, that type of thing.
I think, yeah, that rigid approach to almost anything in the NHS doesn't work. I think flexibility and adaptability and different approaches for different systems is crucial. It's really important.
And it's also important for us for the NHS to ask for them for suppliers. I think sometimes empowering the SRO within the organisation to say, you can ask for what you need and how you need that. And I do think the voice of the NHS needs to be louder. So strategies for operational leaders and to ensure that systems are seen as an integral part and not just an extra burden. I always liken it to everyone picking up a smartphone 10 years ago. And before that, if you had told them that this is what you have to do in the next 2 years, there would have been uproar around, well, why can't I just use my landline? And now it's just the extension of people's arms. Everywhere you look, people are using, and that is a digital solution to something we used to do very analog. So yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a really valid point in that it's not something extra. It's not something we're bolting on. It is an integral part of the way we do business on a daily basis. And if we get the journey right, as we reflected earlier on some of the words that Dan was saying, if we actually engage early enough, and I'm an ex-sales guy from IBM, back in the good old days, benefits actually sell, features tell. Yeah, you've got to understand what is the benefit to the individual user groups, and that's right across your hospital, whether you're an allied health professional, a nurse or a doctor, whether you're in this clinical group or that clinical group. Yeah, they all have different needs and they all have different ways of working. You've got to put that work in. You've got to really, really understand that. Then and only then can you actually build that up, wrap that really back up into how you're going to manage that on a day-to-day basis. And the other thing you need to do is to provide all of those user groups a single point of source to go to diversify the comms. So what do I mean by that? What I've always tried to do is go out in as many ways as I can, face-to-face as much as you can, emails, which people never have time to read, webinars, all of those things, but at least bring them back to a central source. So on my last project, what we did, it worked so well. Right in the early days, we built our own intranet page and we just published everything on there, whether it was video content, whether it was linked to e-learning, whether it was the register for doing face-to-face training, whether it was the quick reference guides, the QRGs, whether it was the SOPs. We just put it all in one place, then we can just point people there. You've got the QR code on your phone as you're walking around. This is where you want to go, guys. So it allowed people simple access to the way that they work and think, and also in the time that they have free to actually do this. So strategically at the top layer, it's embedding it in as part of your daily working practice. Yeah, as we like to say, you can't manage if you can't monitor. Yeah, so it's absolutely critical that the information that you're gathering on a daily basis feeds back, and it doesn't really matter what you're monitoring, whether it's the number of patients coming through ED, whether it's the number of patients turning up for elective. Yeah, that information's there within the systems. As we all know, and most people probably on this call today have lived through, early days of changing, different pass systems into full EPRs now that we've got on that diversity. There is so much information around, but when you really think about it, you're drilling it down to the core information you need to do your role. Yeah, and it's presenting that in a smart way, in a simple way. As Dan said, when you're designing these things, think at the front end. One of the things I constantly find myself saying 3 or 4 times a day: does it work as designed? Good. Does it work as desired? No. What went wrong? Yeah, something clearly went wrong there. So it works as designed, great, but it doesn't work as desired. That fundamentally, those 2 statements explain to me why just installing it isn't good enough. Yeah, we should always be looking at our systems and sweating our assets anyway. Yeah, I don't need to go out and buy a new bed management system. I've already got this thing here, whatever it happens to be. I'm just putting some general descriptors out there. So we should always be sweating our assets. Now, if we're always sweating our assets, that means that we should always be maturing the systems that we have. Yeah. How can we use them in a much better way? And by the way, when we've got the likes across our hospitals of the likes of Dan and people embedded in our services at a clinical level who also have a wonderful digital vent, they're the people that spot these opportunities. Yeah. But then, of course, it's all about that monitoring and management. So what I would say is, what is it you're putting in? What information can you provide to me? And I'm sure we're going to touch upon reporting and BI a little later anyway, in that it's absolutely key to all of these things. It has to deliver on the promise first and foremost, but we have to be able to monitor the promise. Otherwise, we can't manage the promise. And that to me is how we actually start to really tie this together. Early involvement, what is it you're going to need on a day-to-day basis? By the way, you have to be bold enough to say you're not going to be able to do X, Y, Z. You're going to be doing A, B, and C. You really do have to say it. Spell it out at every meeting. And by the way, if you genuinely believe that your systems and services that you're providing can do that, be willing to stand up to the challenge by the people asking you. And it's in my experience over quite a long time now that I've found new opportunity for the future. Some of those new opportunities blossomed into new products and new services, quite frankly, because we were able to go, ooh, because we don't all know everything. We can't possibly. Yeah. So be willing to be challenged, be willing to listen, be willing to take action and make notes. Yeah. That old adage of 5 seconds of something bright. If you haven't done something about it, you're going to lose it. You will. You've got to be making notes. I've made a whole page already just from the stuff Dan said. So onwards and upwards. Krishna.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's a communication both ways, isn't it? It's making sure that actually we're active listening and making sure that kind of flows in as well. So, and talking about that then, Dan, so the role of user feedback in refining the system post go live, how do you think that clinical teams, ensure their inputs translates into meaningful changes? So, so quite often we get asked, actually, can it do this? And it's a completely different system that they're talking about, so it's kind of like making sure that actually they're very focused on this is what this this can do, what else can it do? But yeah, how do you find clinical teams can do that?
Yeah, good question. I was just reflecting on your point about smartphones, Krishna, and remembering all my days on the ward carrying a bleep still.
And finding a phone to call. Yeah, exactly.
I think like post go live user feedback is essential for several reasons. Like for iterative improvement, and as a developer, it's crucial that you undertake this process. Firstly, it makes your product better. It helps identify pain points, areas for enhancement. I like Steve's work is designed, work is desired. I think that's a really clever saying. I think it's one that I'm gonna note down and remember to reuse. But clinical teams can ensure meaningful change by establishing clear communication channels for feedback, prioritizing actionable insights, regularly updating the system to address concerns without overwhelming users. Previously, when we've worked on projects, we've done this through having user groups initially. And then if you have a product that expands, making sure you invite a kind of broad church of people to those groups. From my particular area of interest, a clinical safety point of view, you have to have feedback systems in place. It's really important that you can log potentially dangerous errors or system failures when the machine isn't working as expected. That has to be reportable. You then prioritize them on the backlog, and this is a requirement for products that are released into the NHS. You have to have a logging process in place. I think the feedback for design is one thing, but anything surrounding clinical safety, there has to be robust systems in place that can capture those. Something that starts as a design flaw can very quickly become a clinical safety concern, and so you have to have mechanisms in place to flag those and get them on the backlog.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Dan. And just while you were saying that, just reflecting on the fact that actually making it easy to do that, that's the only way, isn't it? Because actually it's at the time, and all of us have this in our everyday life. Oh, well, I'll just go and do that. And if you don't have something to write it down or do it, send that, that disappears, doesn't it? So yeah, no, now as well. And so now that we've talked about the user feedback and things like that as well. So I do find sometimes when we have this and we have some really rich feedback, actually operational leaders then get a little bit scared, because that's then, we've already gone live, we are post go live. So, what do we do at that point? How do we then make sure that those changes are reflected, I suppose, in the system and things as well?
Yeah, no, that's really important. And just on your even question there, when I talk about system, I instantly think about the whole thing. That's the people and the actual technologies. It's absolutely key, because often we don't need to change things digitally. What we do need to do is behavioral change and how we're using the data that's actually come through. And that's where we start looking at some of that early stuff. So as we start looking at the user feedback, you're right to use the word people get scared. Yeah, it's really difficult to see the wood for the trees in this game. Everything is volumetric. Yeah, you roll out a system, the number of patients we see a day is increasing. Often we're being challenged on our KPIs to get more patients through the system in a tighter time frame, yeah, which is kind of diametrically opposed to some of the things we were actually trying to achieve in that kind of approach. So when we're actually, to me, the whole thing revolves around that early planning through to beyond go live into that feedback mechanism, that constant feedback mechanism, and turning it into the words for the specialities. And what I mean by that is, it's almost like if I look at a line of all my clinical user groups, yeah, they're all at different places in a race. They really, really are. Some people will push it through because they see how they could improve their services themselves by that behavioral change, yeah. But you have to do it closed circuit, sorry. And what I mean by that is, what you need to do is remember you've got e-learning solutions that people are still using for that system. You've got to go back and tweak those. The face-to-face classes when we onboard people, you've got to go back and tweak those, because otherwise everything happens in isolation. Yeah, you've got you've got a couple of intakes a year of your junior doctors coming in. So you've got to really close that in. So capture that information, that feedback, sift your way through it. Don't be frightened to break it out into operational, clinical, and digital. Yeah, because it should go across the whole piece. But make sure you close the loops, your training, your education, and of course, any future tweaks, because no system sits in isolation. Yeah, there are always upgrades. There are always things that need to be done. We should be keeping those in mind. Log it, measure it, manage it, that whole stuff. Just absolutely keep those through. But probably most importantly, and you touched upon SROs earlier on, is making sure that SROs understand their responsibilities within the game that we play, understand that the SROs understand the responsibilities into the future game of what we're doing, because it's so easy to go, it's in and we got in with the least amount of pain. But now is, it's like my dad said when I was young, you've got your driving license, now you can go out and learn how to drive. Well, that's the reality of it, yeah. It's so easy to just think, let's not do the pain. And you used the word earlier on, that whole optimization. I see only too frequently it gets struck out the plan because the next big problems come. Yeah. Do you know what? Optimization should be embedded across the whole trust at all times in whatever you want to call it. And I'm not a big, whatever you want to call it, whatever works is absolutely key. It is a constantly thing. Back in my ITIL days, I used to be a service manager at IBM, and I used to be out talking about that continuous service improvement cycles should be built in whenever you sit down, whether you're suppliers or internally, doing those reviews of visits working. What are we doing to improve it? How are we going to improve it? Yeah. Unfortunately, we all know everybody wants to drive, the cost down and function up. Yeah, that kind of often doesn't work. So continual service improvement, but give some the responsibility to know that. Yeah, because if it's not somebody's responsibility, it's not going to get done. Yeah, one of the things I say to everybody when I talk about this stuff is, and it's so true, and I've seen it across pretty much most industries, but it works in this just as well. People do what we inspect, not what we expect. Yeah, absolutely key that we remember that. So you've got to put the monitoring in there, and you've got to put the actions in there, and even the feedback loops. If you give me feedback, I'm going to tell you gave me feedback and what I'm going to do with it. Otherwise, it's just a void. Yeah, we have far too many voids that we throw stuff in, and we think it's going to get sorted. Somebody has to have responsibility for it somewhere along the lines, even if it's a minor responsibility, but don't get dropped off the list. Is my opinion on that piece. And and we should all drive that with energy in real terms.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That reminds me that so when we do this and we do it well, one of the things I get really excited about, which is strange, is governance, because I think actually governance is really important, but it can be such an empowering mechanism, I think, in organizations, especially organizations with such huge diverse stakeholders, because actually what you're doing is you're empowering the right person to make a decision because it is it's been assured by the people that need to assure it, and the people who need the reporting, and we'll come on to that in a minute as well, have that as well. So yes, it's that type of, and therefore it does become important, and people understand that, go live, then optimization. You can't optimize before you start a new workflow. And one of the things, and I think just you picked up on there as well, Steve, is it's not always just the digital solution. It absolutely is maybe an extra training need, or a way of working, the cultural aspect of this as well, that actually this is a way that we're going to start working. How can we support everyone to do that and to do that well as well? So yeah, thank you. So the resistance comes on to the cultural change, I suppose, but how do you address resistance, Dan, from among clinical staff? But also, I think it's about sometimes the resistance between clinical and operational staff that everyone gets a little bit overwhelmed with the digital demands.
Probably the $1 million question, isn't it, Krishna?
Yeah.
And I'm coming from that as a clinician as well. So it's something that I actually thought about a lot when I was working trying to implement technology. It's so hard to actually drive change among clinicians who are busy trying to balance their clinical tasks. I think, as I said before, people have such poor experience with NHS IT systems, and also people get used to doing things a certain way and their way works. The digital demands in the NHS can already be overwhelming anyway. So I move trusts every 6 to 12 months. When I move trusts, I have hours and hours of e-learning to do. Every time I move jobs, I move to a new trust and get a completely new set of systems to work with. So there's already a huge amount of demand on clinical staff anyways. I think probably addressing resistance starts with empathy. I think acknowledging the challenges that clinicians face, making sure you provide robust support. We mentioned comprehensive training that's adaptable to the needs of individual staff. Peer champions, as we said, as Steve said, really important. Clear communications, internal ownership of the system, and also the benefit, sort of extolling the benefits of the new system, and involving staff in shaping the solution to make them feel part of the process. I think that reduces the feelings of being overwhelmed in general. I found like implementing a system as an outsider is very difficult, and change really has to be championed from within. So as you mentioned, robust governance channels are really important. leading communications from within the organisation. We found this, Krishna, having champions among the senior clinical staff is very, very important. For some reason, it just lands a lot better when it's coming from a senior clinician. And then obviously, as we said before, understanding workflows is essential for success. How people work at the moment, how will the new system work for them, and will it do what it needs to do, is really important. Good training, intuitive design, I think all of that helps limit feelings of being overwhelmed. And I think, yeah, it's I think making users see the purpose, providing a solution that actually makes their life easier rather than harder. And technology for the sake of technology doesn't work in the NHS, it just doesn't land. So yeah, I think having something that's actually going to make your day-to-day clinical life easier rather than add another system that you have to log into that doesn't communicate with your EPR system is crucial if you want clinicians who are already busy to engage with your system and use it.
Yeah, brilliant, Dan. And like you said about workflow though as well, it has to become part of, this is how I do this. This is how I say hello to a patient, you know, and making it a bit more real about what it is that they're doing rather than this is how I switch the system on and log on and do this, you know. So it's not about that. It's about the fact that actually when I'm looking and I'm talking to a patient, this is how I'm doing my job. And it has to be, I think you said this, Steve, as well, that has to be part and parcel of what they do. So then obviously we talked a lot about clear communication and consistent communication and things as well, Steve. So how, in your experience, how do you do that? So what role does that kind of play, and how do you do that, including the trust communications channels and things as well, just to make sure that staff understand where they can go? Because I think one of the things is that suppliers come in sometimes and they do great training, they do a great rollout, but then they disappear, and actually no one knows who or where to go. So yeah, so what do you think about that during and post go live?
It's a great question. It really is. And it made me reflect in preparation for today. So I got into the crossroads of healthcare and IT 20 years ago. And I remember my early presentations, I always used to put the patient in the middle, right in the middle of everything we do. And then I started to think about that and I started to move it around. And at one point I put patient/practitioners because the services and systems we provide have to, of course, give excellent care to the patients, but they have to work for the practitioners using them. And then a few years later, I reflected again and I crossed them both out and I just put the big P for people, because this is all about the people, everybody that touches our systems and services, whether you're a patient or whether you're just a friend or guest of the patient, whether you're a practitioner of what we're doing to the whole pieces. So when you're working with the internal comms team, even some of the external comms teams, when we give, sound bites to, because we often do by local press, etc., you've got to think about that whole piece. And you go back to basics again. And I know we keep reiterating some of the basics here, but it's absolutely key. If you get the basics right, the complex tends to follow. So start with some really key messages at the front end of the benefits of the thing you're trying to, whatever it is you're trying to implement, whether that's to improve, I don't know, the capacity of your bed management system, or whatever it happens to be. If you get those early benefits up front, when you sit down with your comms team, try and educate them on the things they're doing. They're great at comms, they're great at writing. I can't do that. I'm a Yorkshireman, English is my second language. They will put the words right for me if I have the content. But what you want to do is, it may seem a little bit twee, but as Rianne will tell us, it's about branding. Yeah, this little thing that we do, this project, affects so many people, not even hundreds, thousands of people it affects, and ultimately tens of thousands of patients. So start the branding early. Put some sound bites in there that you can allow people to at least get excited about it, or at least understand it's coming. I've gone to meetings in trusts 3 months after we've gone live, and without a fib, people have put their hand up and gone, "When are you going live?" I'm like, how can that even be a conversation? Yeah. And yet you've done all the kind of right things. But I accept the fact that people are busy. I accept the fact that they're human, they could be off. So there's lots of reasons for it. Yeah. But what we do then is it's our own internal lessons learned. Now then, this is a really crucial point on kind of the thing we were thinking about earlier on is feedback is absolutely key, and we need to track and monitor. I said that already, so I don't want this to be but it's the opposite side of the coin. As Daniel Cardeman said, and anybody that's read his book Noise, you will understand there's always a lot of noise around. So people like me with a digital background will be parachuted into a clinical set of circumstances, and I don't know what's good, bad, or indifferent. I don't know where the baseline is. I don't know what the noise is. So this is where having that local expertise is absolutely key. So when I'm talking to the comms team, who's my clinical person within that team? Who's my operational person within that team? I can cover the digital bit. Just sure you get it right, because you've got to rise above the noise, otherwise you have no voice. But the voice does need to come within the services, as Dan quite rightly knows. No clinician's going to listen to Steve Lobley. He's that guy from IT, for goodness sake. What does he know about this stuff? And I've done a lot of presentations, I mentioned recently, and every single presentation I try and make unique, which is that a lot of work for me? Of course it is. But it's the only way I'm going to engage. Nobody's going to engage me if it's not fresh and good for them. So you talk to a few people in each speciality. Try and just get an idea. You're not going to be an expert. You're hardly scratching the surface. But it needs to be unique to them. Yeah. I was a kids entertainer for many years. And I used to say to my kids all the time, there's a reason why you got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Yeah. Yeah, do it in proportion. We should be doing that as well. It's so easy to just come in and talk and kind of not listen. So that is absolutely key. The comms piece starts right at the beginning. It continues all the way through. It drives into your lessons learned. And ultimately, it should continue through. Now, it never happens, but what I would suggest is there should be anniversaries on these things as we do our digital output. Reflect on the year. And some trusts, the CCIOs, the COOs, etc., are really good at, let's reflect on the past year from the things that we've done really well in our hospital. What's gone in. We all know that the things that worked well don't get a mention because they didn't cause any problems. It was nice and quiet and calm, yeah? Everything that blows up. One of the things that, having done this for 40 years professionally, and I did my first exams in the 70s, is even if nothing changes legislation-wise or service-wise and things, the minute you move from a piece of paper to something digital, you'll be held to a higher standard, simply because people can see the effect of the thing you've done. Yeah, end of story. So you may as well go in with open eyes on that one and go, well, I'm going to be measured more. Yeah, I used to have it with my nurses. Well, I've got to start filling all these forms. There's far too much information. Well, you always had to do that in your paper health record, but your job's been changed so much that you can't do this. Yeah, and it often takes time for that to filter through. So we need to be aware of that absolute fact. And if you speak to the people who do the auditing, who really do the checks and balances on what we're doing, that is absolutely key to that whole piece. Yeah, brand it. You can't tell them too many times. I said on my last project to my COO, I want people to be sick and tired of my voice by the end of this, because I know I've spoken enough. Yeah. And only then can I step away. Yeah. And do you know what? It's the right way to do it. Find passionate people, drive them through the systems, brand your comms so that people know what it is. And by the way, at the heart of that is the naming convention. I have worked on so many projects where mid-project, we changed the name of the project to get it. Even my very last one, we changed the name of no wonder people don't know what's going on. Yeah, people close the project, get lost. So at least agree on it. But don't be shy as digital leaders, as clinical leaders, to use the terminology that works for your audience. Yeah. So if you're presenting or whatever you're doing, if you've got an audience in front of you, go back to basics, use the words they understand, even if the project's called X. And in fact, the best thing to do is put them all in there. I mean, just mention them all. That way people go, oh, you mean that? Yeah, I do mean that, because everything is running at a pace of knots. We're dealing with often, very intelligent people, but are often under a lot of stress and don't have a lot of time. Yeah. Our job as communicators, which is back to the communications point, is it's the job of the communicator to make sure that the audience understands. It really, really is. Yeah. And that means that you're going to have to understand your audiences. Otherwise, you will miss part of your audiences. And that duty is on us. So use the internal comms people who are often busy. Use them to do the finessing. But don't be shy to do the groundwork yourselves, and just have a branding message, because then at least you know what you're working on, because most people work on multiple projects as well. So it reminds you, bang, my brand. A little tip I did, because sometimes I might be working on 4 projects, and I have done this. I haven't done it recently, but I've done it in the past, is I will literally have different backgrounds for each project, so that when I'm glancing up and I'm looking at my own notes and we're in full flow, it just reminds me where I'm at. Because in IT, they get very, very similar. And I have been guilty of mentioning something thinking, actually, that was about that, and it's like anything. If you're ever going to lose your audience, their confidence in you to do what you do does that. And I come from an old school. I mean, I did my project management training in the early 80s with Hoskins, but I don't call myself a project program manager. I call myself a project leader. And I do that on purpose. And I'm not shy to say it, is because we're on a journey. And of course, I have to do the governance correctly, as you mentioned, the clinical sign-offs, my hazard logs. Everything has to be done professionally. But we have to lead, and we have to lead from the front. And if we don't do that, we won't deliver. What we'll do is tick boxes. And you're absolutely right. We'll go live. We'll give ourselves a pat on the back. We go, can I have another project, please? Yeah, don't cut it, does it? It's exactly why we're here today. Make sure you're embedded in those services, and hopefully if you do a good job, you continue it through. And the other thing I'm passionate about as a contractor, doing what I do, is to make sure the BAU teams get that kind of support that they need to kind of keep that driving through, because unfortunately we do tend to move around quite a bit. But I tend to stay on site for quite a while to make sure that we embed that, bringing in unique skills and experience, which to me demonstrates why we do what we do. Yeah. Bring in the specialists for that short period of time, deliver on what you need to do, and then allow the teams to do that. And whilst you're there, allow those teams to grow with you. Absolutely key. And one of the things that we do at King, you've got it behind you. Yeah. I mean, our whole strap line, yeah, is about empowering people. And the duty of care that we all take, people who work for Keystream and contract through Keystream, it's something we take to heart. We really do. It's a really important thing, because ultimately it's about the people. I'm not arrogant about that. When I was at IBM, I used to be arrogant and say, I can deliver IT, but it's about behavioural change. That's where I struggle. Yeah, IT, that's what we do in spades. Behavioural change, a bit more difficult. So that's where the focus needs to be as we go forward. So yeah, comms, brand it, brand it, brand it. Can't have too much branding.
Thanks, Steve. And that's really important, isn't it? So actually, one of the things that I always do, and it only takes 2 minutes at the beginning of every meeting or any kind of talking about that particular solution or a new way of working, is to go back to the vision. So people often think, and I used to think, I used to be one of these people, I used to work within the NHS, and so I used to think this is all very flowery language. It was about the vision. People used to always say, what is your vision? And I say, oh, come on, we just need to get on with it. But actually, by reminding people of that 30-second vision, it brings people back into the room and those goals that you set for yourselves and for that particular organisation as well. So that we can always, this is why we're here. We're not just talking about, and we're not doing this on the side of something. This is absolutely why we're here. And this is what we're trying to drive forward as well. So that's very important. I just want to touch on the reporting that you were just talking about there, Steve, actually. And this is a question to both of you, I suppose, because Dan, I know that you've designed the reporting as well as having to do that on the other side as well. I think that thinking about the metrics you're going to hold yourself to account on of how this is successful is really important to design right at the beginning. How are we going to measure impact? How are we going to know that what we have set out to do is done? How do we know? So yes, we're saying that go live is not the end. What is the end? How do we get there? So it's a question to both of you. How do we encourage people to think through? We're right at the end now. How do you want to feel? I always talk about how people want to feel. So yes, it's about the kind of tangible, but how do people want to feel at the end as well? Dan, Steve, I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe Dan. Yeah.
Go for it, Dan.
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's a really good question. I think it's about having a clear goal that you're setting out to achieve at the start. So it's a little bit like what we're saying about implementing solutions that don't solve a problem. Yeah. Trying to force the square into the circle. I think you need to have a clear vision of what you're trying to achieve, and we've done this before. We've set out to implement solutions where the client isn't quite clear what they're trying to achieve. They want some technology because technology fixes everything, and then halfway through you're thinking, well, what does success? We're going to hit milestones. We know what the milestones are. We've got a go live plan. We've got a training schedule. But actually, what does success look like in this project? That has to be clear at the start. You have to know what you're trying to achieve. And I think just to go back to then what Steve said earlier, is it working as designed and is it working as desired? And I don't think you can answer that unless you have a clear metric of what you're trying to achieve from the get-go. It's quite common because there's so many stakeholders that will all want to have their piece of the new piece of technology, and people will all want to have it working for them. It can quite quickly get lost what your actual goal is. But I think having a very clear, measurable and achievable aim at the start is really important. We've often got halfway through projects and then try to look back and think, have we made a difference? Without having that clear goal at the start, it's kind of impossible to know that.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Go on, Steve. I'm going to let you just answer that quick question. And I've got one from the audience as well.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll keep this pretty punchy then, because I'd love to hear the questions from the audience. So yeah, at the end of the day, make sure you're capturing the metrics, all data. We're providing digital systems. So as long as we're capturing that data, we can shape that. But have a view of what you need but don't be frightened to shape it. But also, as you're going live, one of the things we do as part of our closure reports is to analyze all our service desk issues to make sure there haven't been any sort of infrastructural type impacts. Yeah, we're often putting IT systems on put of ropey equipment anyways. So look at all of that as you're kind of going forward, and don't be frightened to shape what it is you're doing reporting wise. Our BI teams in most trusts now are mature and broad. Yeah. Again, very much like I say about rolling out the projects, if you're doing something very specialized, don't be frightened to get some external consultancy support services around, the BI that's needed for that, because it's getting more and more complicated. And with the introduction of AI and other things, I think that's going to become more and more prevalent. So they will help build those systems so that we can really crunch that data and use it in a way. And ultimately, let's remember, we want to be able to provide that information back to our practitioners to make smart decisions. We all know the work has been done through Pax and Riz over recent years and massively improving, but it's across our whole piece. So what I would suggest is you get early views of your, use the 80-20 rule as always. Get your baselines up front, get your views up front, but ultimately make sure you're capturing all the data that you needed. And if you're not sure, capture it in a safe manner, because then at least you can run those reports. So I'm going to keep that tight because I'm looking forward to hearing what some of our audience want to talk about.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you very much. So we've got a question from Cathy Albuquerque. So what should we do when stakeholders are unengaged, resistant to change, and don't see the benefits of implementing a new system, even after every effort has been made to involve them prior to implementation, to highlight how the change will support them in the long term as well? So how do we solve that?
Well, this is going to sound really cheeky, and it's a great question. Of course, it's a $64 million question, isn't it? But I would say is every effort hasn't been made. Whilst people are still willing to listen and talk, you've got a fighting chance. Now, does this make it hard? Absolutely. Will you win everybody over? No. So what you need to do is, my own personal approach has always been, literally worst case scenario, we're going to go and have a coffee. We really are going to go and have a coffee, and we're going to sit down, and I really need to understand it. Now, this person may not be willing to give me time. So then I'm interested in having a coffee with somebody who sits on that team or within that peer group. Now, does this sound like a lot of heavy lifting? Yeah, probably. But it's like all these things. Prevention is better than cure. We're in healthcare, for goodness sakes. Yeah. Let's at least try and do that in the way that we have our dialogue with our stakeholders and our clients. Now, I come from old school. Everybody's my client, quite frankly, whatever they are, whether in operations, digital or clinical, they're all my clients. So you've just got to find ways to get that person over. If it's at an individual level, now, of course, it's very much a pyramid effect, and it's a hierarchical effect, and it's a management effect. The higher you go up the pyramid, that is trickier. Yeah. And I'll go back to what I said earlier on. You get them in a room at the beginning. On my last project, I went to my COO, and I ultimately, I was cheeky. It was a demand. If you want me to do this in the time frame you said, I need people in a room, I'm going to talk to them, and they need to be your managers and your people. Yeah. I got 127 people of the senior team in a room, and we spoke to them firsthand. That COO, I didn't need to speak to again for the next 12 weeks till we went live, because I got the bought in from her team. Yeah. Now, of course, there are people who are negative and the naysayers and all the rest of it, but everybody's opinion in my world counts. Yeah, because that's what's in their mind, and that's what will cause me a problem. So I'm willing to go the extra piece. And I know that sounds a little bit trite, but what else are you going to do? If you've done the governance correctly and the comms and branding correctly, and you understand the benefits, and you've kind of done it all, sometimes you can't win them all. Yeah, but don't be frightened to talk to their peer group. And don't be frightened, as I said earlier on, as the people who are leading on these things, get in front of the group. Yeah, because if you can't support the thing you're trying to deliver, I would argue you shouldn't be delivering it. Yeah. And have I been put in those positions? Of course I have. And was it right to move me on at the time or increase the team or whatever? Probably. But most of the projects I come into, I'm never the first project manager or program manager. I could be the sixth or seventh. That's quite sad. But you've got to look at why. It's not necessarily the individuals. You've got to look at the circumstances. So I'm just not going to repeat the error, whatever that error is. Yeah. So just do your best, work really, really hard, be willing to be open with them. And at the end of the day, if all else fails, you've kind of got an approach, you've got it documented, it is what it is. Yeah, feel safe. But what I always say is, and I'm going to end on this right at the end of the call anyway, but ultimately just be kind. I mean, seriously, because none of us know what's going on in anybody else's mind. Yeah. And I don't take it personally. I have a job to do. I say this all the time. Sorry, I know I'm going a little bit and I haven't got a lot of time. I like to work with people who I like. and I like to work with people who can deliver. And if I can only have one, I'm going to go for the delivery. If I get the approach right, and I've been working for a long time now, I can count on one hand the people I haven't liked. So I'm going to put myself as a common denominator there. Yeah. If you can adopt that, you'll do all right by me. Dan.
Thanks. I think just to add a couple of points. I think communication obviously key, as Steve says. So probably don't need to talk about that anymore. Just from a clinician point of view, and being a receiver of health products, I think one of the things I think it's important just to reassess stakeholder roles and expectations. Like Steve says, be kind, be empathetic, be aware that people working in the health system are very, very busy. And often they just need their roles clarifying. You're taking up time that they might need to spend elsewhere. They've got lots on their plate. So I think clarifying their role and adjusting their expectations. And then also, I think something that goes side to side with that is just making engagement easier. So minimizing the time commitment required. I think we're all guilty because with teams, it's very easy to put time into people's diaries and to have a meeting. It's become very, very easy. But minimizing the time commitment and involving people in the decision making makes that I think helps to smooth over that process. But yeah, I think it's reassessing stakeholder roles. I think is quite important. What do you actually want from your clinicians? What do you need from them? Is it communications? Because it can feel quite onerous when you're being asked alongside your full diary of clinical responsibility to take on an additional role. So I think just being aware of other people's time is quite important.
You raise a good point there, actually, Dan. So one of the reasons I think sometimes stakeholders are unengaged is because they're supposed to be. So what we do try to do in the NHS is we try to roll a new way of working out to the whole world. And actually, we don't need to. So sometimes it's because they don't need to use that system, or they don't actually, it doesn't touch their way of working. So the roles and responsibilities really important. And again, all in the design stage. All of this, none of this should be talked about at go live. None of this should be talked about post go live. We should have designed this a really long time ago. And thinking about roles rather than people. Sometimes in an organization, some of these things take over a couple of years. By the time you've gone to go live, they've left. And so although you put that person in that position to bring everyone together, it wasn't the right role that you put in the right position. You just put that person because they had the right personality. And all that's really important. You also need to find actually whose job is it? Whose role and responsibility is it to make sure that this is a success? And let's put that person in the middle of what we need to be doing as well. I'm really hoping that was helpful, Katya. I think what we've been talking about really is really, really helpful. I think it's been some really great insights as well. One of the things I just wanted to quickly touch on is how can lessons learned? So one of the things we're really bad at, I think, in the NHS, and I don't know why, because we're not the private sector. There is no, there's no espionage going on here. So I don't know why we don't talk to each other. How do we get those lessons learned to other organisations? We've always done this. This is how we worked. Dan, I'm going to come to you on that because I do think it's the clinical teams that could be talking more, or do they? And we don't know about this.
No, I think it probably comes back to what we're saying about people being busy and burdened with their own workloads. I think people don't talk about these things. It's not seen as important in their daily schedule. I mean, from a purely project management point of view, we know how to capture lessons learned. We know how to do it. We know how it should be done. We know why it's important. It just isn't prioritized in the NHS when you have a clinical commitment. And as we said, previous question, how do you actually get people engaged? If people aren't engaged in the implementation steps, they're not going to be engaged in the lessons learned steps. So from a clinician point of view, I think it's quite difficult and quite challenging. There's also not a lot of sort of organizational learning. People move on, people change jobs. Reshuffles all the time across the NHS. People go to different organizations or they leave into the private sector. So you don't have that long-standing learning that happens within the organization. So I think it's very difficult from a clinician point of view. I'm not sure if Steve's got any thoughts from an operational point of view. Maybe it's a bit more organic in operations.
No, it absolutely is, Dan. And just to reiterate and support both of what you just said, let's remember corporate memory is very short. It really, really is. So if you start with the branding, keep the messaging going through. So then when you come to do the lessons learned, ask yourself the question. We know the mechanics of it, as Dan quite rightly says. Why are we doing it? Yeah. So my thing is, I want to document it and I want to share it. So I've been very lucky. My last couple of projects, I've managed to bring in other trusts who have come to site. I mean, the last trust that came in to look at one of the projects I did, I think 17 people turned up. I was able to share the lessons learned documentation that I'd done beforehand. I was able to share my own experiences, and I got people, other stakeholders within the trust to do that and share that. So to me, that's just part of the commitment that we should be looking to do. The other thing it does, it absolutely embeds or continues to embed that knowledge as we go forward. As we all know how the memory works. Yeah, we don't remember the first time something happens. We remember the last time we talked about and remembered it. So it's a memory on top of memory on top of memory. So if that's the case, let's us take it on board to keep the corporate memory solid. Why are we doing and why have we rolled out the system of services that we have? Did we learn those lessons? And importantly, how can I use those lessons the next project and programs that we're going to do, so that it just doesn't become another dusty thing in the drawer? I know we're talking digital and I did a paper metaphor there, but I think you take my point.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you very much to, for everyone taking the time to attend the webinar. We will have a snippet of this sent out to everyone as well, so you'll have the recording. And thank you very much, Dan and Steve, for taking the time out of the day to talk about this. I think it's really, really important. I do think that the sector needs to start talking about this a lot more as well. So yeah, bring on more of these. Thank you very much and have a good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the time.